Hello, my name's Duncan Ross. Welcome to an exclusive preview of the Impact Rankings 2020, which will include a masterclass showing you how we put those rankings together. To start with, it's important to remember that Times Higher Education's mission has always been to support universities, students, and faculty in understanding the performance of universities across the world. And traditionally, we've viewed this through a prism of three different key missions. The first mission is the research mission, perhaps sometimes seen as the only reason for universities, but in actual fact, only one of the many elements that universities can excel at. The second mission is the teaching mission, where we look at how universities support future generations and strive to provide the best quality education. And the third mission, which is the focus of today's talk, is impact and innovation. And at Times Higher Education, we have three different sets of rankings that allow us to gather the data that underpins this analysis. So for the research mission, we gather data around the World University Rankings. For the teaching mission, we gather data around the Japan University Rankings and around the US College Rankings. But last year, we launched for the first time our Impact Rankings, focusing firmly on how universities can make a direct difference to the world. And that's the focus of today's talk and today's masterclass. Our Impact Rankings differ from our other rankings in that they are very clearly related to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Why did we choose to make this decision? What's so important about the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, the goals allow us to see a route by which the world can transform itself into a truly sustainable environment. With a target of 2030, these goals cover a range of different areas, from no poverty, through zero hunger, through climate action, industry, innovation, infrastructure, and finally to partnership with the goals. And this broad approach truly gives us a roadmap which can show us how the world can transform, but it also gives us a mechanism to understand how universities themselves are working towards delivering those goals. And this is very important because when we look at universities across the world, there are approximately 23,000 universities. And at Times Higher Education, we believe that roughly 5,000 of those can be described as research intensive. But that leaves a huge range of higher education institutions who are doing fantastic work in their communities, but where we don't have an insight into them and where they don't have an opportunity to showcase the brilliant work they are already doing. And we hope that our impact rankings can start to close that gap. They're truly open to universities and higher education institutions across the world. In order to understand how the Sustainable Development Goals can be enacted by universities, we put together a simple theory of change. And this is really a framework which helps us to understand how to measure institutions. So how could a university impact against the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, the first way is through the traditional route, research. Research is a key driver towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. If your university is researching into battery technology, for example, that clearly has a direct role to play in terms of reducing and building up clean and affordable energy sources. But there are also other ways that universities can work towards the SDGs. The next most obvious one might well be teaching. Universities have a key role both in educating students to be the leaders of tomorrow, but also in terms of ensuring that key workers with key skills are provided so that they can take up their role in society. The third aspect it's stewardship. Universities are often major stewards of both human and physical resources. How they look after those, how they protect those, is a key part of their work towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And the final area is outreach. How universities reach beyond their own community and out into the wider world. How they bring back that link with society. The Sustainable Development Goals themselves, there are 17 goals, and the United Nations has already created from that 169 indicators and 223 unique targets. In building out our impact rankings, we've done a one-to-one mapping between the SDGs and our rankings. But beneath those, we've built out our own metrics and our own measurements, which we think reflect the way that universities can bring their unique perspective to addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. When we got to the end of that process, we then made sure that the measurements that we were looking at could be related back up to targets. It's not a perfect match because the goals themselves aren't designed for higher education. They're designed for every single organization and government throughout the world. But we hope that the mapping that we've done gives us some useful insights into university performance. But it's important that we recognize that particularly when we're thinking about Africa, there are some key decisions to be made when designing a ranking. We wanted to make sure that this was straightforward for universities to participate in. We accept that not every university has an institutional research department. Often the data required is in many different silos within the university. And so we wanted to make participation easy and straightforward. And as part of that, we made a crucial design decision. We decided that we would require universities to submit data for SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, which looks at the overall relationships that universities build out towards driving towards the Sustainable Development Goals. But that beyond that, we only required participation and data submission in 3 of the other 16 SDGs. And as we'll see later on, that also gave us a unique insight into the focus of universities around the world. After all, why would a university in Harare have the same focus as a university in Manila, or indeed a university in Oxford or a university in Los Angeles? We also spent a lot of time thinking carefully about the metrics. We discussed this not just with experts in the field, but also with many of your universities at our events across almost 2 years. And we were very careful to listen to input from universities. We recognize that we bring our own biases into this process, and we do deeply appreciate the effort that you're taking to help us improve the ways that we're measuring, and particularly to tell us when things that we're measuring or approaches we're taking are not appropriate in your particular setting. The final thing to say about this is that we need to also be aware of the difference between the concepts of equality and equity. And in this particular ranking, we've taken effort to try and ensure that more of our metrics lean towards equity, that they recognize the baseline situation in different countries across the world, rather than the traditional approach of equality. And I think we'll see some of that later on in this presentation. So let's take a look at one particular SDG to give you an idea of the approach we're taking and the kind of questions that we've asked universities to provide data for. So here we're looking at SDG 11, which focuses on sustainable cities and sustainable communities. Here we look at 4 broad areas that we want to explore. We want to explore research. We want to explore arts and heritage because although people often think of sustainability in terms of physical sustainability, it's also important that the unique cultures and heritage of our communities are sustained and protected. We also look at the spend that a university has on arts and heritage. And then finally, a section on sustainable practices. When we look at research, we do this with our bibliometric partners Elsevier. And for each SDG, we have a basket of keywords that we use to search through their Scopus dataset. And so all the metrics for each SDG are individual to that SDG. In the case of SDG 11, we look at 3 bibliometric measures. One looking at the top 10% of journals, or the proportion of publications that fall into the top 10% of journals. That's a measure of the excellence of the academic output. We also look at field-weighted citation impact, and this is a slightly different take that looks at what a typical publication in this area would look like, how its performance would compare to its peers across the world. But finally, we look at a measure that looks at the volume of publications. There is no doubt that when we consider impact, the amount of research that's being done is a key factor, as well as purely the quality of that research. We can dig slightly deeper into this and try to understand how those keywords are reflected in terms of the publications that they highlight. When we look at the SDG 11 keywords, what we can see on the right-hand side of the screen here is how those particular topics, those papers that are highlighted, are distributed across a wide range of different subjects. If we look around the ring, we can see that we have various different subjects identified. The closer in a bubble is into the center of the ring, the more interdisciplinary that research is. And this is something we see time and time again when it comes to research around the Sustainable Development Goals, but truly these are interdisciplinary areas of research. When we look at the second area, arts and heritage, we actually ask universities for a very different kind of data. In this case, we're asking for evidence as well as simply looking for numbers. In this particular case, we're looking for evidence around how universities grant access to heritage and culture where they're the custodian or the guardian. For example, public access to libraries, to significant buildings, to museums and collections. We also ask about how universities are recording and preserving that heritage. But when we ask for evidence, we need to have a new way of interpreting data that is not just quantitative, but is also qualitative. And so in order to do that, we've put together a relatively straightforward scoring approach. So the first thing to say is that if a university tells us that they do something, our default position is to trust universities. We believe that universities are seekers after truth. They are generally honest and above board in what they do. But because we've also asked for evidence, we're able to compare that evidence to the question that was being asked. So in this case, we're asking about public access to significant buildings, and a university might provide us access to a website that shows opening hours. That allows us to assess the degree to which that evidence matches the statement that we're looking to answer. We would also give extra credit in that case because the evidence is public. And we believe that where that evidence is public, it gives both ourselves and the university a stronger piece of evidence, a stronger example of what they're doing. It can be tested not just by us, but also by the community more widely. In some cases, we also ask additional questions. So, for example, we might ask, is that access free access or is it charged access? But this gives us a very strong data set which we can use to explore how universities are performing. When we look further on in this particular SDG, we also see how we are trying to group particular sets of metrics together. In this case, we have a series of metrics that look at commuting and how we look to remote working, something very important to all of us right now. We also look at how universities interact with their local communities in terms of the housing stock they provide and how they make sure it doesn't impact on others. And finally, we ask some questions in this SDG about building. both on brownfield sites and, if on greenfield sites, building to sustainable standards. Now, as well as producing rankings for each SDG, we've also chosen to combine these, as I mentioned before. And we combine them by taking SDG 17, which is the mandatory SDG, plus the 3 highest SDGs that a university submits to. So if a university chooses to submit to all 17, then we will take the 3 best of the 16 plus SDG 17. We combine those to produce an overall result. Let's look briefly at the top 10 from last year. This is all last year's data. So at number 10, the University of Hong Kong. At number 9, the University of Bologna. Tied at number 7, the University of Montreal and KTH Royal Institute from Sweden. At number 6, the University of Gothenburg. And one thing we can see here is that although those universities are all doing well, there is a mixture of SDGs which they are strongest in. Moving into the top 5, King's College London from the UK and the University of Manchester, the University of British Columbia and McMaster University from Canada, and finally, in the number 1 spot, the University of Auckland from New Zealand. Now, there were no African universities there, so I thought it would be useful to showcase how the top African universities performed. So let's look at some of the top African universities from last year. And we can see that in each of the 7 countries whose universities submitted data, that their universities performed not just at an overall level, but also at a very strong level within individual SDGs. For example, the University of Ghana, although it was only in the 301 plus category, was ranked 15th in climate action. Similarly, the University of Ibadan from Nigeria was ranked 47th in quality education. And the University of Western Cape performed very strongly in SDG 10, reduced inequalities, and SDG 5, gender equality. Last year, we saw 467 universities from across the world in the overall ranking. This year, and this is the start of the new data for you, this year the numbers have increased significantly, with 857 universities participating overall, and with a final overall ranking of 776. And we can see that the numbers across the world have grown in every region. In Africa, the number of universities participating has grown by 43%. Of course, we would love more universities still to participate. And if you remember a while earlier, I talked about this idea of allowing universities to submit to only 3 SDGs plus SDG 17. And what this has allowed us to do is to explore how different parts of the world respond differently, how they focus on different SDGs. This is the overall pattern. And we can see that the most frequently submitted 2 SDGs are SDG 3, good health and well-being, and SDG 4, quality education. But not far behind that is gender equality. And I can go further. I can use this as a baseline to see how the number of universities participating in each SDG varies by region. So if we look at Europe this year, what we see is that the most commonly submitted to SDG 8 and SDG 16. SDG 8 is decent work and economic growth, and SDG 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. Lo and behold, that is pretty much the European Union in a nutshell. Conversely, they are less likely to submit data around SDGs 1 and 2. SDG 1 being no poverty and SDG 2 being zero hunger. And again, that's perhaps not surprising. The European Union is a relatively wealthy part of the world where poverty and hunger are less of a pressing concern or are perceived as that by their universities. When we look at Africa, in contrast to Europe, we do see a focus on SDG 1, We also see us focus, interestingly, on SDG 5, gender equality, often driven by the North African universities. But we can see here that we see very different patterns of focus from universities around the world. And so for the final section, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into our new data. And I'm going to explore how that data can inform us about how universities are prepared to play their part in the current pandemic crisis. In particular, I'm going to look at some of the measures that come out of SDGs 3, good health and well-being, SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. But it's important to recognize that other SDGs are equally important. So SDG 1, 2, and 6, so that's no poverty, zero hunger, and clean water and sanitation, because the lesson from previous pandemics is that those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who have least access to clean water are most at risk. Then SDGs 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, because a strong infrastructure and innovation are going to be key factors of addressing the pandemic. But also SDGs 16 and 17. 16, peace, justice and strong institutions. We will all have to be strong in this time of crisis. And SDG 17, because truly addressing this is an international effort. And SDG 17 talks about how we relate across countries and across institutions. So let's start with SDG 3. SDG 3, good health and well-being, really focuses on how universities are participating in making the world a healthier place. It seems the obvious place to start in a pandemic. 622 universities have provided data for this SDG this year, including 38 universities from Africa. And 5 African universities are already in the top 200. But when we look in detail at some of the questions we're asking, we can see some that have a very direct relevance to the particular pandemic outbreak. The first two are research measures. And the research measures we've chosen to look at in SDG 3 are not the traditional ones. Rather than looking at citations alone, firstly, we've looked at publication downloads. How often are people actually accessing and reading the research, even if they don't necessarily cite this? Is this practical advice? Is this practical insight that is going to be used? Similarly, the second measure, citations in clinical guidance, addresses how frequently the research that's being done by universities is picked up and put directly into best practice. The third measure that's crucially important is looking at how many graduates with health degrees universities are providing. These are going to be our frontline fighters in the war against COVID-19. And then the final two measures we're looking at, collaborations with local and global health institutions and community outreach, explore how universities are ready to actually take the lessons and implement them in the wider community, either with existing health organizations or directly themselves. Of course, the data we're looking at doesn't reflect directly to the COVID-19 outbreak, but universities who have experience of working in outreach will be better prepared to actually provide support and advice when that time comes. And if we look at just these measures rather than the wider basket, then we see that the number of African universities in the top 200 grows. We see the following universities: Mansoura University, Alexandria University, Aswan University, all from Egypt, the University of Tunis El Manar from Tunisia, University of Pretoria from South Africa, Asyut University from Egypt, and the University of Ghana would all be ranked in the top 200 if we look just at those measures. Of course, we'll have to wait until later on in the month to explore how they perform in the wider perspective. But this suggests that African universities actually are able to reach higher when we look at these key areas in addressing the outbreak. The second area that I'm going to explore is around education. Whereas SDG 3 looked explicitly at how universities could support the fight directly, SDG 4 enables us to think about how universities can play a role both in supporting their existing students, but also as being a key hub for learning and for those people who may need to shift their careers or learn new skills as a result of the economic impact of the pandemic that's happening right now. 678 universities participated in quality education this year, including 42 African universities. 7 African universities will be in the top 200 and 4 will be in the top 100, which is an absolutely amazing performance. But 3 areas that are interesting here are firstly around how universities are providing access to educational resources for those not studying at university. This is interesting because it also includes evidence on non-traditional mechanisms of teaching. If we have to work out how to teach remotely, then this is a key aspect of that. The second 2 look at how universities can play the role in broadening access to education. Again, as I said a few minutes ago, a key role for universities in the years to come. How you do outreach activities and how you make sure that those outreach activities are genuinely accessible to everyone is a really important measure of the preparedness of universities to support after the virus itself is defeated. And then the final area I want to focus on is around decent work and economic growth. And again, there are different ways of looking at this in terms of how prepared universities have been to support the action against COVID-19. The first one looks at the role of universities as key economic drivers in their communities. And this is something that is often underappreciated. If you were to take a university and drop it into Boston, it probably wouldn't have a huge impact in terms of the economics of Boston. On the other hand, if we took a university and put it into rural Africa, it could have a massive impact economically, both in terms of the economic draw, the increase of resources in the community, but also in terms of the stability of that employment, the stability of that economic inbound activity. And so when we look at expenditure per staff, we normalize this by the regional GDP per person. We take account of the different economic situations where universities may be situated. The second 2 measures look at how we can ensure that that economic input is fairly distributed, that the employees are on secure contracts and that they are paid a decent working wage. So how do African universities perform? Well, if we look primarily at the economic input that African universities are providing, we see a picture that is very, very positive. It's my view that from this data that African universities are going to be key economic anchors in terms of their communities, not just in terms of the wages they bring, but also in terms of the opportunities they provide to help the economies of the world to get through the crisis that is undoubtedly coming. We see here universities from Africa that would be in the top 100 just looking at that economic measure, that expenditure per faculty. Universities from Algeria, Tunisia, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Ghana. It's a fantastic credit to African universities that they will be playing that key role. So if I was to summarize, hopefully what we've seen here are some of the ways that the data that underpins the impact ranking can shed a light, not just into how universities are addressing the sustainable development goals, but also about how they can sustain communities, sustain our countries when we see crises such as the pandemic we're facing at the moment. And particularly in terms of COVID-19, we can see how the health work that universities are doing is going to have a major impact. We can see how the educational role that they play is going to be key in offering opportunities for the future. And very importantly, we can see how their economic role, their underpinning of their communities, is going to be a significant factor going forwards. Above all, we believe at Times Higher Education that universities have a unique role to play in their ability to act with strength, but also crucially with authenticity. That universities are a key part of society, that they have a vital role to play, and that they will go on playing that role as they have done for generations past. So thank you for listening to me. I hope you have found it interesting and informative. And I hope that the sneak preview of some of the data that underlies the rankings has been useful as well. And I hope that you will be able to join me later on in the month when we launch the full rankings, looking not just at those SDGs, but across all 17 SDGs. I will be doing that at our online forum on April the 22nd. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. That's a fantastic presentation. Gosh, there's so much there, and sadly not much time to go through the questions. I'll start. We've had one question immediately from Louis Amaleo Adekola, and he says that he's interested in knowing, does student voices count in this ranking at all? He says that we at Advent Edge Africa work with higher education students in Africa, and it's amazing how the incredible works of African students are not usually taken into cognizance. How do you respond to that?
No, thank you, Tim. The short answer is that it isn't included directly. We don't have a mechanism for asking students their opinions about their universities or their insights directly. But because we're asking for evidence, we can see in that evidence, if a university chooses to provide evidence of the great work that their students are doing, then that becomes part of the record, that becomes part of the ranking.
Okay, thank you. And then another question that we've come in is around wealthier universities that traditionally do well in Times Higher Education and other research-based rankings. I mean, how are those kinds of institutions faring in the new impact ranking? And do you think that over time, those wealthy institutions will be able to kind of understand how to do better and rise to the top of the impact rankings, or can you do something to correct that?
Well, we have tried, as I said earlier, we have this approach which tries to move more towards equity rather than equality. Let me give you a concrete example. One of the measures that we use in various forms is the proportion of first-generation students attending a university. So those students where no one in their immediate family has previously attended. And it's a pretty good measure for how universities are tackling various kinds of inequalities. It cuts across, it's intersectional. But if you're in a country which is wealthier, which is typically where our wealthiest universities are, you're more likely to be in a massified education system. So there are fewer people left whose immediate family haven't gone to universities. So in that sense, we hope that some of these metrics, by choosing them carefully, can not tip the balance against wealthier universities, but rather provide some equity for universities in less well-off parts of the world to showcase what they're doing. I mean, at the end of the day, though, it's absolutely true that if, for example, Harvard University chose to spend some of its $37 billion endowment on addressing the SDGs, it would probably do a pretty good job of doing it. But we do want this ranking to genuinely showcase the work that universities are doing on the ground. And that often isn't necessarily coming from the traditional high-flying institutions.
And in terms of genuinely showcasing, I mean, what's the approach to data checking and verification for this ranking?
Yeah, so the approach, as I showed for the evidence that's submitted, is based firstly on an assumption that we believe that universities are trying to tell us the truth. We're assuming that no one's out there deliberately trying to deceive us. But we do assess the evidence that's sent in. I have a team of people who are doing that, and they will do that in native languages as well. So if, for example, your evidence is in Arabic, if you're a Middle Eastern country and you are doing work in the community, why would you produce a health brochure in English? You would produce it in the relevant languages in Arabic. So we do have teams who have members of our team who have language specialities enabling us to assess the evidence. But we're also relying on giving extra credit when evidence is public, because that allows, that holds universities up to validation by their public. If you say you do something when you clearly don't, then hopefully you will be held to account for that.
And you also mentioned Harvard as an example with their enormous endowment. I mean, so how do you feel overall about participation? I mean, are there any more countries or institutions you'd like to see get more engaged?
I would love to see more institutions engaged that haven't traditionally engaged with the university rankings. And there are some obvious reasons for that. The World University Rankings are focused at research-intensive universities. I would like to see more universities that have a strong community focus or a strong teaching focus to become involved, because we think this really can offer them opportunities to show the world, the wider world, what they're doing, and hopefully to give people an opportunity to learn from that. We must remember the goal of the SDGs isn't necessarily about competition, but competition can encourage people to drive towards better solutions, to learning from others, to trying to spread best practice around the world.
And in your view, therefore, do the impact rankings give a good indication of how important reaching the SDGs are for the countries in which participant universities are located? Countries where there's lots of universities participating in this, does it suggest as a more general higher value on the SDGs?
Partly. I think there is there's no doubt that the submissions we're getting are reflecting, as I showed earlier with those slides showing the different SDGs that universities were submitting to. There is clearly a reflection in the data we're getting back about the importance to which countries, systems view the SDGs. But it's got to also be said that this varies significantly within countries. In the United States, for example, the land-grant universities and the state universities are much more likely to participate. But that's perhaps not surprising because this is part of their core mission and always has been. So I think there are some things about that, but there's also this question of access. Universities have to be aware, they have to be have the mechanism to supply data as well. And so we do see differences around the world.
That actually ties on to, there's a question from Professor Cesar Wazan at Qatar University, who says that judging, says the evidence submission needed is making his teams work a lot more to submit data for this ranking than other rankings. So, is this going to be, as he describes it, overtake the worldwide ranking?
Well, firstly, hello, Cesar. Yes, we acknowledge this is actually much more challenging in some ways in terms of data collection, not least because often the data we're asking universities to supply for this ranking is not focused within the university. It may be split across multiple parts of the organization. A good example would be we ask universities about the proportion of their energy that comes from low carbon sources. Now, that information will be available somewhere in the university, but possibly not in the Vice Chancellor's office or the Rector's office. So gathering that data can be quite difficult. Having said that, one of the positives we've seen from the ranking is that it's encouraging universities to gather this data together. And we hope that that will enable universities to become much more strategic about their approach to sustainability. And finally, to Cesar's last comment, will this overtake the World University Rankings? I don't know. The growth in this has been meteoric. We've gone from 400 universities in our first year, which was in itself a huge commitment by universities, to 857 universities who've participated this year. It's quite possible that in several years' time, this will be larger in terms of participants than the World University Rankings. And my final comment on that, before you ask me another question, Tim, is just to say thank you to all the universities who chose to participate. We do appreciate that this is a lot of work, but we hope that the insights you'll gain out of it will be worth that participation.
And two final questions, perhaps. It's a lot of work, and partly because we're including metrics on teaching this year, as well as stewardship and research and outreach. And so can you just explain a little bit what sort of data are you collecting on teaching?
So it's always really difficult to collect data on teaching. We have teaching focused rankings which stand by themselves, and those are based largely around a survey of students. Now, doing that on a global scale is both technically and logistically challenging. So rather than doing that, we have two aspects in which we're looking at teaching, or two main aspects. One is in terms of the production of graduates with relevant skills. So for example, as we saw looking at SDG 3, we're looking at the proportion of your graduates who have a degree which puts them on a track towards the health professions. But the second one is something that comes directly out of the Sustainable Development Goals. So for those of you who've read the Sustainable Development Goal documentation from the United Nations, you'll be aware that 4.7, SDG 4.7, focuses on education for sustainability. Now, what we've actually asked universities to do is to, rather than asking that in SDG 4, we've put that in SDG 17 because we think it's a core aspect of what universities should be doing. And also SDG 17 is our mandatory SDG. So we hope that, and the question we're asking there, sorry, I should have said, the question we're asking there is about the commitment universities have to education for sustainability. We're also asking them if they are using their own system, their own device system, or they're using an external approach, such as the SULI test system. It doesn't matter which system people are using in terms of the scoring, but we're very interested in whether there are consistent ways of doing this or whether universities are effectively crafting their own solutions.
And one final question, as I'm afraid we are now over time. This is just a technical question from Umesh Bawa. Is the discipline of psychology defined as a medical subject in the ranking assessment?
Psychology within the impact rankings would be not treated as a subject at all. So it would fall within health and well-being if it came into the keywords that the research is measured against. And for those of you who want to validate those keywords, they are available on the Mendeley platform. In terms of the World University Ranking, it is classified separately. Psychology is classified as its own discipline because of that very tricky question about does it fall within clinical or does it fall within life sciences or indeed potentially in other areas, social sciences, for example.
Great. Well, thank you, Duncan. Thank you to everybody for the questions. And I'm afraid that in terms of our schedule, that's all we've got time for today. But please put in your diaries that Duncan and Times Higher Education will be launching the full data from this year's Global Impact Ranking on the 22nd of April, so 3 weeks from today. And we'll be hosting a virtual mini summit, a full day of masterclasses, discussion, analysis, and celebration of outstanding impact from universities in Africa and all around the world. So please join us online that day. We'll send you emails with links of how to take part. And also, of course, please check timeshighereducation.com. And as I said earlier, I'm very happy to say that we'll be running a face-to-face in real life forum hosted by the University of Pretoria, where we'll pick up these conversations and I'm sure advance them much further next year on February the 3rd to the 4th, 2021. So we'd love to see you all there in person. But for now, I'd like to thank Duncan, thank all of our panelists earlier, and thank you for watching, asking questions and taking part, because you, your colleagues and communities have the full support of Times Higher Education in all of the amazing, vital work that you are doing. And I hope that you can stay safe, stay well, and keep in touch with us in this extraordinary time. So take care and best wishes from me, Tim Savula, and goodbye.